The topic today is maintaining cognitive health and managing stress with aging. This is an important health topic, especially for seniors. As we age, our brain functions start declining. We keep misplacing items. We cannot remember just as well as we used to. And why is that? Today's presentation will address that and give us tips on what we should do to keep our brains sharp. Our speaker today is Danielle D'Amico. Danielle is a PhD student in psychological science at X University, formerly Ryerson, and a trainee with Canadian Consortium on Neurodegeneration in Aging. Danielle's research centers around the biological, psychological, social, and behavioral factors that influence cognitive health with aging, with a specific focus on chronic stress and healthy lifestyle behaviors like diet, exercise, and social engagement. Danielle is also interested in the use of virtual programming to facilitate cognitive health and well-being with aging. Aside from research, Danielle is passionate about the benefits of lifelong learning, which is what we are doing in these sessions. And she is also involved in several knowledge exchange and community outreach programs. We are so glad, Danielle, you made time for us, accepted our invitation, agreeing to do the presentation for us, and we look forward to hearing from you. Over to you, Danielle.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to share my screen and then I'll get started. Okay, thumbs up if you can see my screen. Okay, excellent.
You're good.
All right, I'll get started. And so, but just before I get started, if anyone has any questions, just to put them in the chat and then get to them after. I can't see the chat while I'm presenting, so get to that after. Okay, so thank you very much to Naz for that lovely introduction. So as he mentioned, my name is Danielle D'Amico. I'm a PhD student at Ryerson, and we're using the designation X University until it is renamed. And I'm studying psychology, as he mentioned. And so my goal today is to tell you a little bit about the topic of stress, lifestyle, and cognitive aging, a topic that I'm very passionate about and that my research focuses on. And that'll be the bulk of the presentation. And then at the end, I'm going to talk very, very briefly about a study that I'm conducting in case anyone here is interested in the study. We can talk about that at the end. And so before I go on, I just want to acknowledge that the land that I'm currently talking to you from, referred to as the city of Toronto, is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, and the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people, and I just want to acknowledge that today. And so just to give you all a bit of an idea of what I'll be talking about, so I'll start with some background information on the research on cognitive aging, so what that means. I'll then talk about the biopsychosocial predictors of cognitive aging and the relationship between stress and cognition. And then I'll finish with some information about how and why healthy lifestyle behaviors are important for reducing stress and for maintaining cognitive health with aging. And then again, like I mentioned, I'll finish at the end very briefly with the research study that I'm conducting for my PhD research. And so just to start us off, I'm going to talk a bit about what cognition is and what the different types of cognition are. And so the reason why I do this is because a lot of times people hear the term brain aging, cognitive aging, and they automatically think of memory, which is true. But in fact, the cognitive processes and our cognition is actually made up of more than just memory, and it's more than just memory that is important for keeping our cognition healthy with aging. So firstly, like I mentioned, memory. So I'm sure everyone knows what memory is, that kind of our ability to remember different types of information. But there also is different types of memory. So for example, there's what's called prospective memory. So remembering that you need to do something in the future, remembering that you have a doctor's appointment on Monday at 10 a.m. and you need to leave at 9 a.m. to get to that appointment. And then there's procedural memory. So like riding a bike, tying your shoelaces, making a meal that you've made a bunch of times throughout your life. And then episodic memory. So that's memory. For example, if I gave you a list of words and asked you in 20 minutes to list off those words, that would be like episodic memory. You're recalling specific information from the past. And then secondly, executive functioning. So this is a term for a collection of higher order abilities like complex reasoning, problem solving, switching between different tasks, and also what's called working memory. So a good example to illustrate what this means is if I was on the phone with you and I told you a phone number and I said, and I listed off the phone number, but you needed a pen and a piece of paper to write it down. But while you're searching for that pen and the piece of paper, you're trying to remember that, keeping that stored in your memory as you go do that. So that's a good example of what working memory is. And then next is attention. So quite literally our ability to maintain our attention on different things that we're carrying out. And then next is visual spatial skills. So this is the ability to orient yourself in time and space. So for example, knowing that you have to go to the mall and knowing the route that you take to get there. So figuring out the best way to walk there or drive there, where to park, where to walk to get to the door, etc. And then next is processing speed. So this is the speed at which we carry out our thinking tasks. And then lastly, verbal skills. So our vocabulary, our ability to understand language that we are fluent in, those are verbal skills. And so I won't talk a lot about the brain itself, but of course, these cognitive processes rely on the functioning of our brain. And so there are two main brain areas that typically undergo changes with aging. And so the first one on the left side of the screen here, the frontal lobe. So that would basically be the part of your brain right here, like underneath your forehead, at the front of your head. And then the next one is the hippocampus. So this is a structure that you can see in blue here, and it's deep within the brain, and it kind of looks like a horseshoe, or like some people say it looks like a shrimp. And the frontal lobe is responsible for higher order abilities, like I mentioned, executive function and attention. And then the hippocampus is important for forming and recalling memory. So it's like our memory storage center. And of course, I just want to say this is a very simplified version of what's going on in the brain. So these two regions are very highly connected with each other. They talk to each other all the time. And they're also connected with other areas of the brain that I haven't mentioned in order for us to carry out these cognitive processes. So it's a very complex system, but this just kind of gives you an idea of what's going on under the hood. And so I gave you a list of all these cognitive domains, but not all of them typically change with aging. And so I just want to outline a few things that typically change, or that as we age, we're at higher risk of changes. And so the first is the storage and recall of new memories. So for example, episodic memory, like if I gave you a list of words and asked you to recall them later, that might change normally with aging. The second is processing speed. So things tend to slow down a little bit. That's a normal part of aging, or can be a normal part of aging. The next one I wrote, the tip of the tongue phenomenon. So this is when, I'm sure everyone here has experienced this, when you know the word that you're trying to say and it's there and you feel it on the tip of your tongue, but you can't quite find it, that kind of phenomenon of word searching. And so that's completely normal at every age, but tends to happen more as we age. And then next is complex reasoning, so carrying out complex cognitive tasks. And then finally, working memory. And so this is that example I gave you of if you were needing to write down a phone number, and you're keeping that phone number in your mind as you search for paper and a pen to write it down. And then also, it's not all downhill. So there are cognitive functions that actually often, typically with the course of normal aging, either improve or older adults tend to maintain. And so some examples of this would be the recall of memories throughout life. So autobiographical memory, remembering your wedding day, remembering where you worked growing up, just sort of like information about your life. The next one is pre-existing skills. So if you're a musician, if you were an accountant throughout your life and you crunch numbers all the time, or whatever these skills that you have, they typically don't tend to go away with aging as long as you keep at it. So that's why I have here use it or lose it. And then the next is verbal ability. So our vocabulary and our language actually tend to improve a little bit compared to younger adults. And this makes sense because as you get older, you are learning, or you are being exposed to more words throughout your life. And then the next one, semantic memory. So this is just basically memory for different facts. So remembering who the president was at a certain point in time, or who won some specific game in the Olympics at a certain time, if you are into that kind of stuff. So different sorts of facts like that. And so this graph here is basically a visual representation of what I just said. So I'll walk you through it. Basically here at the bottom, represents different age groups. So what the researchers did in this study is they measured different cognitive abilities in people at these different ages. So from as young as 25 to as old as 81. And then these are the scores on the different tasks. So a higher score would be indicative of better cognitive ability, and a lower score would be indicative of lower cognitive ability. And so the different colors here represent different types of cognition. And so, for example, the verbal ability, the blue one here, you can see it's lower at 25, but actually goes up throughout life and maintains kind of overlap by the other colors, but you can see the dark blue here is relatively stable. However, we have perceptual speed. So this is like processing speed, the speed of carrying out different tasks in green. And if you track that throughout life, it tends to decline. And so there's also other ones here like numeric ability or math ability tends to maintain, improve a little bit and then go down and is maintained. But this sort of just shows that there is variability and it's not all downhill. And so I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about dementia itself, but I do want to mention, I think it's really important to mention, what dementia is, which I'll get to, and then that it's not a part of normal aging. So it's not considered destiny that every older adult is going to get dementia. It's not normal. It's actually considered a disease and a disease of the brain. And so dementia is defined as an umbrella term describing a set of symptoms causing a person to have changes in brain function that interfere with the ability to function and do everyday activities. And so you can see here that there are different types of dementia. So the most common is Alzheimer's disease, and then vascular dementia, Lewy body dementia, and frontotemporal dementia. And these would be different diagnoses that a doctor would give, but they are all different types of dementia and not a normal part of aging, actually considered a disease of the brain. And then also here, which I think is really important to mention, is that there is this middle ground that the researchers and clinicians have seen and is a really important part of this cognitive aging if someone is going to go on to develop dementia. And so it doesn't go from being cognitively intact to all of a sudden having dementia. There is a gradual decline. And in a lot of people, this middle ground, this gradual decline in yellow is called mild cognitive impairment, or MCI. And so this is defined as noticeable cognitive difficulties. So there are these changes in cognition, but they don't necessarily interfere with daily activities. So you're still able to function and carry out activities to take care of yourself. However, people with mild cognitive impairment are more likely to go on to develop dementia. But what's really key about this period, MCI or mild cognitive impairment, is that there is some research showing that engaging in healthy lifestyle behaviors, which we'll get to later on, can actually sometimes reverse mild cognitive impairment or at least slow down the progression to dementia. So there is things you can do to help, which means it's a really important stage. Again, not a normal stage, but an important stage. And so next, I just want to, because I get a lot of questions often, like, is this normal? I experienced that. Is that normal? And I just want to say I'm not a medical doctor or a clinical psychologist. So oftentimes, like, I can't answer yes or no, but there are questions that I get over and over. And so I just want to go through a few of those of, should I be worried if you were wondering if you experienced this, should you be worried? And so I just want to say first, obviously, always talk to your doctor. That's the most important first step if you're ever worried, but this will just kind of give you a general idea. And so the first one, forgetting the name of someone you just met, not a cause for concern, totally normal. I do it all the time. Actually, I'm really bad with names. Not a big deal. Getting lost in the mall the first time you go there. So that is completely normal. If you're not familiar with the space and you're going for the first time and you get lost or you don't know where you are and you get turned around, totally normal, not an issue. Forgetting an item that you meant to pick up at the store. So again, not an issue, happens all the time. You go and you mean to buy milk and then you buy everything else but milk and you realize, oh, I forgot the milk. Not indicative of any problem, most likely. And missing the details of a story you're telling your friend. And so if you're telling a story and you forgot minor details, but you kind of get the gist of it, or you have the general storyline, but you miss certain details, not an issue. And not knowing the current date offhand. And so totally normal if you say it's Saturday, but it's actually Sunday, or it's Thursday, but it's Friday, or I think today's the 27th, but you say that it's the 26th. Not a huge cause for concern, normal, not an issue. And then telling the same story at different occasions. So let's say you see your friend on Saturday and you're telling them a story, and then you see them again a couple weeks later and you tell the same story because you totally forget that you told it before. Probably not a huge red flag, not a big deal. And then on the other hand, forgetting your spouse's name. And I mean totally looking at them and genuinely not knowing who they are, totally forgetting their name, probably a cause for concern. Getting lost in your own home. So I mentioned before, you go somewhere for the first time, you get turned around, totally normal. But if you're in your own home or in a place that you're very familiar with and you get lost and you have no idea where you are or where you're going, a red flag. Forgetting having gone to the store an hour earlier. So let's say, you go to the store at 1 p.m. and you're talking to your friend at 4 p.m. and then you totally just don't know that you went to the store, probably a cause for concern. Forgetting the gist of a story you're telling your friend. So it's normal to forget details here and there, but if you forget the general idea of what you're saying as you're telling a story or you're telling someone something, potentially a cause for concern. And then thinking it was currently 1963. So obviously not normal. And then telling the same story over and over again in the same conversation. So if you're having coffee with someone for 2 hours and you've been telling the same story 4 or 5 times throughout that conversation, potentially something to be worried about. And so I just want to say one more time that these things are not a diagnosis by any means. They're just sort of red flags to keep in mind if you ever were talking to your doctor or had a concern, or you don't know if you should make an appointment or something like that. And so next, I'll walk you through this graph here. But a main huge thing in the research that we've seen time and time again is that there are large individual differences in cognitive aging and how older adults perform on cognitive tasks. And so this study here actually was done by my supervisor in her postdoc. And so what they did here was they brought older adults into the lab over the course of 8 years. So they brought them in 4 times and they measured their cognition. And then they looked at how it changed over those 8 years. And so there were 3 main groups of people that they found in this research. And so the first one on the top in the red line is maintainers. So people that generally maintained their function. And sorry, I forgot to mention this side of the graph here is their scores on the cognitive task. So the higher the score, the better that they did on the task. And so you can see here in the red line, they're generally maintaining their function. They're scoring pretty much the same over and over when they come in. And then the green, light green line, minor decliners. So they're declining, but just a little bit over time, not a steep decline. And then finally in the blue line here, major declines over time. So you can see they're starting just under 90, and after 8 years, they're just at about 80. So there's more of a decline over time. And so what they did with these participants is they looked at, well, what predicts how people are going to change over time? Are there factors that kind of signal where someone is going to fit, what group someone is going to fit into? And so they did find some predictors. And so the main ones that they found were education. So the more education someone has, the better their cognition, their literacy level, whether or not they exercise, whether or not they smoke cigarettes, how much social support they have, whether or not they volunteer or do paid work, and then of course genetics. And so this type of study, the study itself, has been replicated many times throughout many different groups of participants and different researchers. And so what we know now is that there are factors that influence our cognition, and they can more or less generally be binned into modifiable and non-modifiable factors. And so non-modifiable would be things that are generally outside of our control. And so of course, the first one is age. Obviously, this is the biggest risk factor. The older you get, the more of a risk for cognitive decline. Genetics, so obviously completely out of our control at this point. Early education, so education in early life, it's obviously difficult to go back and change that. Sex, so females tend to score higher on cognitive tasks, but they are actually at greater risk for developing dementia. And we don't fully know why this is the case, but this is something that's been shown over and over again in the research. And then also socioeconomic status. So people of lower socioeconomic status tend to perform lower on cognitive tasks and have a higher risk of dementia. But then on the other side of the chart here are modifiable factors. So factors that are actually within our control and that we can do something about. And so the first one is diet, so what you eat. The second is physical activity, so exercise. Cognitive engagement, so engaging in tasks that challenge your brain. Engaging socially, so maintaining connections with family and friends and loved ones, and maintaining your social network. And managing stress, which is a big one and one that I'll talk about after. And getting good sleep, making sure that you're prioritizing sleep. And so these factors can also be lumped into different categories, which is, I'll go back before I talk about that slide, but we call them biopsychosocial predictors. So biological factors, social factors, and psychological factors. And so the biological factors I mentioned, genetics. So there's a gene called the ApoE4 gene, and that's a gene that if people carry a certain part of the gene, they're at higher risk of cognitive decline. Stress hormones, so higher levels of stress hormones in the body can be bad for the brain. Oxidative stress and inflammation, so basically more inflammation, the worse your immune system is functioning, the worse for the brain. Having high cholesterol and high glucose levels. So this would be more relevant to things like having high cholesterol or having diabetes, high blood pressure, and stuff like that. And so next are social and behavioral predictors. And so like I mentioned, education, but this isn't necessarily just education in early life. This is also education throughout life. So never too late. You know, going to university isn't the only thing that you can do to maintain your education. Really just learning throughout life about different things, challenging your brain. Social engagement, like I mentioned, exercise, and maintaining a healthy diet. And then finally, psychological predictors. So the first one is personality traits. So there is some evidence that different personality traits are predictive of cognition. So for example, being high on neuroticism. So this would be people who are prone to negative emotions, and low on extroversion tend to have an increased likelihood for cognitive decline. And chronic stress. So I'll save this because I'm going to talk about it in a bit. And then finally, depression, specifically depression that's not controlled or uncontrolled depression. And so now I'm going to focus in on a factor that I study a lot in my research, which is chronic stress. And so research has shown time and time again that high levels of ongoing stress across the lifespan can be harmful for brain health. And stress in early life specifically, so this would be like childhood and teenage years, can have long-lasting effects on our brain, even into older age. And this is because when we're younger, in our childhood years and teenage years, our brains are in a really critical, sensitive period where our experiences tend to basically leave an imprint on our life and our brain development. But the good thing is that our brains are plastic, and this means that they have the ability to change and improve if we reduce stress and make certain lifestyle changes. And so just to go into what stress is and the definition of stress, so I don't think I really need to define it because I'm sure everyone here has experienced stress before. But in terms of research, how we define stress are two main things. So the first one is called primary appraisal. So essentially asking, is this threatening? Is this something that I'm feeling threatened about or upset about, or is negative to me in any way? And then secondary appraisal is, can I cope? Do I have the resources within my life to cope with this stressor that is making me feel threatened and upset? And so when something is stressful, it means that the demands of our environment, so these threatening demands, exceed our ability to cope. So we don't have the resources to deal with them. And then that becomes very stressful. And so there are different models that have been used to characterize whether or not something is typically considered a stressor or stress. And the NUTS model is a good one that I like to use, or the STUN model. You can go either way. And so things that are stressful tend to fall under these four categories. And so the first one is novel, so something that is new and that we haven't dealt with before. The second one, unpredictable, so it comes at times that we don't know about. The third being threatening to the ego or threatening to the self in some way, upsetting. And then the fourth, having a diminished sense of control, so that we don't feel like we have control over that stressor. And so a really good example is the coronavirus pandemic. So obviously it's novel, it's a novel coronavirus. Unpredictable, so even though we have science now to track the disease, it does its own thing, as we know. It's threatening, obviously, to the ego, to ourselves, to our health, to our families, to our finances. And then in a lot of ways, there's a diminished sense of control. So there are things, obviously, we can do to reduce the spread of COVID, but it's a pandemic. And so the more that these stressors hit on these four aspects, the more stressful that they tend to be. And so I just want to say one quick thing is that stress is not always bad. So acute stress or short-term small amounts of stress are actually good, and they allow us to adapt to changes in our environment. So our body's stress response that we experience when we're stressful, we need. So there is an evolutionary reason why we have it, And it's essentially so we can fight or flee in the case of a threatening situation. And so what is bad for our health and bad for our brain, or what can be bad for our brain, is when stress is chronic. So when it's ongoing, prolonged exposure to stress, and our stress response systems in our body are repeatedly activated over and over and over again. And it's especially bad when the stress accumulates throughout the lifespan. So when we have stressors all the way from when we were younger to current present day, and they keep accumulating over the lifespan. And there are implications of this for modern humans, so who we are today, because as we know, our stress response systems were adapted for us to run away from the tigers when they were coming into our caves. Obviously, this would be our ancestors years and years and years ago. But that's really not why modern humans tend to be stressed out. So our stress tends to be psychological stress, so stress that is in our heads, and these daily life hassles that kind of accumulate day by day over and over again. And so these things can turn out to be chronic and then bad for our health. And so specifically, obviously, given the topic of the presentation, I'm very interested in stress and cognitive function, so our cognitive aging and brain aging. And so we know that stress can be detrimental to our cognitive function. And so this graph here, which I'll walk you through, is from a study where they brought in older adults over 10 years. And they came in and they tested their stress, and then they also tested their memory function as well. And so the bottom is just their performance over time. And then this is their cognitive performance. So higher scores here are better cognition, lower scores are worse. And then they categorize people into two main groups. And so the gray-green line here are people with lower stress at baseline, so at when they first came into the lab. And then they track their cognition, and they see there is some decline, but quite a not too steep of a decline over time. In comparison to people in the high stress condition, where you see a much greater change and decline over time. So the study is a good showcase for what stress can do to cognition over time. And so what can we do about it? So this is a big thing that I study in my research and my PhD research, is that yes, stress can be bad for the brain, but we know, like I mentioned, our brains are plastic and we are resilient people. And so there must be things that we can do about it to help offset the effects of stress on the brain. And so these tend to fall into lifestyle behavior. So I mentioned diet and exercise and social engagement. And so this is what I will talk about next. And so the first one here is diet. So brain food, we are what we eat. And so there is a lot out there. I'm sure we've all read in the news, like power foods, specific foods are good for our brain. And yes, that may be true. But what the research shows is that it's not about one specific food or a few specific foods. It's about our overall eating patterns or our diet patterns. And so the diet pattern that's been shown to be good for the brain and can help offset the effects of aging on the brain is the Mediterranean diet or the prudent diet. There's a few different names, but they essentially all pretty much say the same thing. So high intake of fruits and vegetables, colorful fruits and veggies, eating lean meats, so things like seafood and poultry like chicken, nuts and seeds, low-fat dairy, legumes, and whole grains, but then also limiting intake of things like red meats, processed sugar, sugary drinks, cakes, cookies, all that good stuff. And so this picture here on of the plate is actually taken from the newest version of Canada's food guide. And so I like this because it's a very good visual representation of what your plate should look like at every meal. And I mean, obviously, all these little foods you don't need to have. It's just to show you what kinds of stuff you can be eating. And so about half of the plate are fruits and vegetables. About a quarter of the meal is whole grain food, so choosing whole grain breads, whole grain pastas, whole grain rice. And the other quarter is protein food, so lean meats, you see eggs there, salmon, legumes, nuts, seeds, etc. And then going for water as your drink of choice. And so I just want to say that, of course, this is very hard to make good lifestyle changes. I just want to acknowledge that. And this isn't to say that at every single meal you need to be eating perfectly healthy. It's all about trying to make good choices and not limiting yourself and making yourself feel stressed about what you're eating, but just trying your best to get in your fruits and veggies and lower your intake of processed and sugary foods. And then next is exercise the body, so engaging in physical activity. And so I have cardio and strength training. So cardio, things that get your heart rate up, and strength training. And both are good, tend to be good for the brain. And so we know that exercise increases cognitive performance and it decreases the risk of dementia. It slows brain shrinkage. So there's research showing that the brain can decrease, certain brain regions can decrease in volume with aging, and exercising can actually slow that decrease. And it increases BDNF. So BDNF is a protein in the brain that facilitates the growth of new brain cells, new neurons in the brain, and it supports existing neurons, and it helps the brain cope with stress. So exercising actually increases this. It increases blood flow in the brain, which is really good for cognitive performance. And I have down here that brisk walking is enough. You know, it's not that you need to all of a sudden go and adopt like a intense CrossFit exercise protocol. Even just brisk walking, half an hour, just enough to kind of get your heart rate up is really enough. Of course, obviously other stuff is good too, but it doesn't need to be a complete overhaul of your exercise. And exercise the brain. And so we know, like I mentioned before, that education and literacy levels predict cognitive function in the future. And we cannot go back and change the past, but there are steps to take in the present to exercise our brain. And research shows that thinking increases blood flow in the brain and helps to form new neural connections. And so what types of activities should you be engaging in? So they should be stimulating, they should be challenging and complex, not stressful, but so that you feel at least a little bit challenged, interesting to you, so that you take a personal interest in them, variable, so that you're doing more than just one thing. They engage the entire brain. And I have down here, there's very little evidence behind the brain fitness industry. And this would be things like Lumosity and Brain HQ. I can't remember. There's a bunch of different companies. And those things aren't bad for the brain. There's very little evidence that they actually are good for the brain. And so what I like to say is if you're doing these things, you don't have to stop. But if they're preventing you from going out and doing other things that are good for the brain, it might be time to change things up a little bit. And then managing stress. So obviously that's hugely important. So I mentioned before, stress is not inherently bad. It's actually good in small, tiny doses. But it's how we perceive the stressor that's more important than the stressor itself. And so I have here mindfulness meditation. And so I could do many presentations on mindfulness meditation, but essentially this means paying attention in the present moment on purpose, creating a space between your thoughts and feelings and reactions. So a really good example is if someone cuts you off in traffic and that immediate reaction is to like yell and flip them off. Mindfulness meditation is a practice that helps you actually kind of create that space between something happening and then your immediate reaction. And research has shown that engaging in mindfulness meditation helps to strengthen connections between our brain, specifically in the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus. So those are these two brain regions that I showed at the beginning that tends to show changes with aging. And there's also different relaxation techniques like yoga and Tai Chi that are also good for the body, but help to manage stress as well. So those things are great. And then also diet and physical activity. So for example, in my master's thesis, I found that eating a healthy diet, so like the Mediterranean diet that I showed before, actually helped to minimize the effects of stress on the brain. So all these things are good, not only for the brain, but are good for managing stress. And then the importance of sleep. So getting a good night's sleep is hugely important for the brain. And this is the case across the entire lifespan. And research shows that disrupted sleep, especially REM sleep, is an important sleep stage, interferes with our ability to consolidate memories from the day. And so what does a proper sleep hygiene look like? So making sure you're relaxing before bedtime to kind of calm yourself down, put yourself in a state where it's easier to fall asleep. Limiting caffeine intake, especially after like noon or 11 a.m. Obviously, because caffeine keeps you up. Using sleep medications as a last resort. So obviously, this is something that is very important to speak about with your doctor. But there's been lots of research showing that sleep medication can actually be, if you try to come off of the medication, can actually be really bad for your sleep. So only using it if you have to. And then only laying in bed when you're going to sleep. So not doing work in bed, basically. And then finally, and I'm almost done, I know I'm a little bit over, but I will wrap up very quickly. Social engagement. So we are social beings. Our social connections make us happy and fulfilled and are really good for our well-being. And this includes maintaining our social connections and participating in social activities. And the quality of our social networks is more important than the quantity. So having 4 or 5 super close people in your life, family and friends that really make you happy and you feel are supported is better than having 50, acquaintances that you don't really talk to too much. So quality over quantity. And then volunteering as a lifestyle behavior. So I mentioned physical activity, social connections, and cognitive engagement, but volunteering, in whatever way that looks like for you, actually hits on all 3 of these different components and has been shown to be positive for the brain and to be good for the brain with aging. And so I'm not going to go into detail because I want to save time for questions, but I am conducting a research study entirely online. This is from my dissertation research. It's been approved by our research ethics board, so any data is secure and confidential and anonymous. And I am looking at how stress and lifestyle impact cognitive aging in older adults. Instead of going into details about what everything entails, I'll put my email on the slide. So if you're interested, you can email me.
Danielle?
Yeah.
Danielle, we have time. Spend a couple of minutes on that. It's important that you do this research. It's good for the senior population, especially.
Sure, yeah, no problem. So this here, again, the study is entirely online, completed at your convenience, so you don't have to come into Ryerson to do it. It's been approved by our ethics board. And so what does participating entail? So it starts off with an eligibility questionnaire to determine if you're eligible, 2 to 3 minutes, not very long. And then if you're eligible, it'll automatically enter you into the study. And it starts off with a questionnaire about basic demographic background and very basic brief health information. And then there are 3 online cognitive tasks that measure memory and thinking abilities and problem solving. So some of the things I mentioned earlier. And then there's online questionnaires asking about stress and about lifestyle. So like eating habits and exercise, socializing, sleep, and managing stress. And then altogether, the study takes about an hour to an hour and a half to complete. But again, it's online and completed at your convenience. And then, are you eligible? So the 2 main eligibility criteria are being age 60 or older and being fluent enough in English just to understand the study instructions. And also having access to a desktop or laptop computer. So unfortunately, the study isn't compatible with a cell phone or an iPad. You can only do it on a desktop or laptop computer. And then there are other eligibility criteria, which I won't go into detail with, but if you have any questions, you can always contact me. And then quickly, what's in it for you? So obviously this is a big time commitment and I would be so grateful. So those who are eligible and participate get a $10 e-gift card to either Starbucks, President's Choice, Indigo, or the Bay. And then of course, the chance to contribute to scientific knowledge and help me with my doctoral dissertation. And then how to participate. So this is my email here. I'll leave it up on the slide. But you essentially just email me and then I would send you the link and all the instructions and all of that. And so with that, I just want to say thank you all so much for listening to my presentation. I really hope that you got at least some helpful information out of it, and I am happy to take questions.
Excellent. Lots of information there. So
yeah, I feel like I talked a lot. I'm curious to hear from everyone.
No. You covered a lot of ground there. So do you want to sort of go through the chat after you had your drink and
sure.
Yep.
Opening that, okay. Someone asked, the first question I see, telling the same event again or on the same encounter. Not 100% sure what they were referring to, but if they want to clarify, I think this might have been about what's normal and things that are red flags to look out for. Telling the same event. Get on the same encounter. Let me come back to that. Someone else asked, which memory disappears first, recent or old? So this would be, it's a good question. So if we look at Alzheimer's disease, for example, which is, again, that's a disease of the brain, not a normal part of aging. During that disease course, there's evidence showing that more recent memories tend to be lost quicker than older memories. So the brain kind of goes backwards in time. Can you suggest self-conducting tests to assess cognitive level? Can the results of such tests be used to help develop a recovery plan? So I can suggest self-conducting tests. So there is at Baycrest Hospital, I'll put the link in the chat after, I'll send it via email. It's called Cognicity, and it's like a link that you go and you do some cognitive tasks and it takes your information. But can the results of such tests be used to help develop a recovery plan? I would say that would be something that you would have to speak with your doctor or some sort of healthcare professional that you work with, because they would be the ones to help actually interpret those tests and stuff like that. If you're looking for more individualized feedback, and if there's some sort of individualized plan. But I'd say if you're just looking for general tips and tricks on keeping your brain healthy, then the stuff I mentioned today should suffice. Can individuals from the US enroll in the study? My study, yes, there's no exclusion. The only thing is that the gift card is in Canadian, it's a Canadian gift card. And unfortunately, that's the case just because I have my funding in Canadian dollars. So not an exclusion criteria, but any ideas on melatonin use for sleep? Yeah, it's a really good question. So the research on this is mixed. So there is some research showing that it actually doesn't help with sleep, but we know anecdotally, I know for myself, times that I've taken melatonin, it has helped me sleep. I think a big thing is not relying on it. So only using it in certain instances where you need help sleeping and you know you have something big the next day to do, and not relying on it every single night to where your brain needs it in order to sleep, because then it becomes you become dependent on it essentially. Going through. Oh, someone clarified that question. Telling the same event repeatedly on the same encounter, is this not early signs of memory loss? Yeah, so that's what I mentioned before. I mean, early signs on memory loss, I don't know for sure. I think, again, this would be something that would be a red flag to bring up with the doctor. But yeah, if you're telling the same things over and over again in one sitting, so one specific conversation you're having, and that you don't remember you just said it, yeah, this could be a red flag. But if you bring this up, 2 weeks later and you forgot, probably not a big issue. I hope that clarified. Also on spiritual health. Yes, that's a really, really good one. So they're actually, compared to the other factors, I think there's less research on this, but we know that meaning in life and people's spiritual and religious beliefs give people a lot of fulfillment and meaning and social cohesion and community and engagement and on and on and on, that are really, really good for the brain. And this meaning and this kind of like happiness and fulfillment that people get, which is obviously individual for every single person. This doesn't mean that if you're not spiritual or don't have certain religious beliefs that you need to go seek them out, but that if you do these things and rely on your networks and participate in, your community, then those things are really good for the brain. So that's a really, really good one. How good is Provigen for memory health? I am not 100% sure on what that is, but I think it's that supplement. I see it on commercials. The research on it is not very strong. Supplements for memory health, things that are, targeted towards memory health. I would say like they're probably not harmful if you take them. They're not going to do anything bad for the brain. But I would say the main thing is to supplement it with these lifestyle behaviors, like eating a well-balanced diet that I talked about, and exercising and all those other things, and not just relying on these specific supplements. I also think I missed one. Speak more on decision-making and concentration. I'd be curious to know what aspect that person wants me to speak on, but I'm not super familiar. Sorry, go on.
Raza, do you want to unmute and ask your question? No. Okay, I'll ask mine, while he's getting ready.
Sorry.
Sure.
Hello.
You're ready?
Hello.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Hello, Danielle. Thank you for your presentation. It has been an excellent one, especially for me, as I'm interested in this topic a lot. But the question regarding decision making and concentration, what I'm finding is that when making decisions, especially for the older people, is so critical to being able to cope with life and using not only the intellect aspect, but the combination of emotional, social, and context-wise becomes extremely important to be able to cope with life itself. So I was interested that if there is any work that you have done to do with decision-making for the older people.
Yeah, that's a good question. Personally, my research hasn't, but so I'm going to say this with the idea that I'm not an expert in this area, and my knowledge is just based on what I know about other people's research. And so with that being said, there is a lab in my department at the university who focuses on decision making in older adults and healthy older adults, so older adults without dementia. And they've shown that decision making interacts with emotions. And so specifically, older adults, what's been shown in the research, tend to make decisions that benefit the greater good. And so this makes sense if you think about aging. If you think about aging and you imagine you're in your 20s or 30s and you have a long time horizon ahead of you. Okay, so let's say, I have 40, 50, whatever more years of my life, versus as time goes on, that time horizon shrinks, okay? And so what's been shown is that older adults tend to make decisions that not just reflect themselves and their, what's the word I'm looking for? Their like personal, sort of like professional goals, I guess, and start to make decisions that affect the greater good. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I understand. They with more experience, I guess, they have a more to draw upon. But what I'm seeing is that that if older people do not take into consideration the, I know they have experience, but it could be a very limited type of experience, or it could be very narrow type of experience that could affect their ability to cope with life, and that can create more stress and so on and on. That's why.
Yeah, I would say the biggest thing there, I'm not too sure what the research shows, but just based on what you're saying, it just sounds like having good support systems in place to help with those things, and to make sure that decisions are being made that are, conducive to good health is important.
Thank you for your time.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No problem. Thank you for the question.
And I guess with age, it takes the seniors longer to come to decisions or to act on things they have to do and all that, because again, the mind is not as whatever the word is.
Quick.
As quick, as sharp, yep. All right, okay. The question I wanted to ask you was, you mentioned diseases of the brain, dementia and such like. So the process of getting to that stage, you mentioned you're forgetting things to pick up something which, certain items are not as important. Everybody does it. And then there are other things that happen, and then you say, wait a minute, this is serious. I don't remember my wife's name or whatever, right? So I guess at that stage, you go to your medical practitioner or the doctor, and you get, tested for memory loss or memory test or whatever. Is that the process? How does it go?
Yeah, so I would say if there are things that someone wants to talk to their doctor about, or they have concerns, or they're anxious about their memory in any way, I think the process would be that you would go to your general practitioner first, and then it probably varies between different doctors, but they would either do the test themselves or refer you out to specialists. I'm not 100% sure. But they would also know if there's any indication of there potentially being a problem. And so, yeah, this again would be something to talk to your doctor about, because if you went and you said, I have all these concerns, they are the ones with the knowledge to know, okay, that sounds like normal for your age, not any sort of indication of a problem. So we're not going to go ahead and do brain scans or full hours of testing. But if they notice, okay, those things sound like a red flag, those things sound probably potentially problematic, they would go ahead, I would assume, and do some sort of testing, or again, refer you out to specialists and stuff like that.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you. Last call. Any other questions, burning issues which we should raise with Danielle? Don't see anything else in the chat. Okay, Danielle, your timing was perfect. You did very well.
Thank you.
Excellent. I must thank you for putting together an excellent presentation. You covered the basics. You took us all the way through, and how different factors affect our memory, and especially the role played by stress. So it's most informative and wonderful. So thank you so much. I have to thank the audience as well for participating, for attending this presentation. And also next week we have another medical practitioner coming to talk about medical, or at least the science that you should never ignore. And she'll go through some cases and explain to us, why it's important to seek additional help or extra help when you experience or go through these signs. So that is next Sunday. You'll get the notice hopefully tonight or tomorrow. And till then, take care, be safe. And Danielle, thanks once again. Appreciate.
Thank you all so much. I appreciate you being here. Thank you.
Thanks. You take care. Bye-bye.